Good day, students, and welcome once again to another history lesson with a very exciting topic, reasons for the use of Africans as enslaved labor. My name is Roland Seeley, and I'm really happy to be partnering with the Curriculum Department of the Ministry of Education and TTT to bring you this lesson. So let's go into the lesson today. The objectives of the lesson are quite simple. First of all, we'll try to identify the factors of production involved in sugar cultivation up to the 19th century. Then, at the end of the lesson, you should also be able to explain the reasons for the use of Africans as enslaved labor. And finally, demonstrate an appreciation for the experiences of enslaved Africans on sugar plantations. So on the screen is a bread that I baked. And I know many of you would have seen bread being baked, or you may have baked a bread yourself. So I want you to think about the steps that go into making a bread. Just think about it for a while, and you can probably write those steps down, what those steps might be. And I will share with you some of the steps that I came up with. So first of all, you need the dough, and I'm sure some of you may have written that. Or then you put it in the oven. You buy the ingredients, of course, not in that order. And you may have gone back even further and talk about planting the wheat and harvesting the wheat and making the flour. So all of those things that we just mentioned, we can think of them as components in the making of this bread, or the factors that go into the making of the bread. So all of these things come together. You put it in the oven, you buy the ingredients, you plant the wheat, you knead the dough, and as a result, you get a loaf of bread. Let's transfer that to sugarcane and sugar production. There are different factors or components that go into the production of sugarcane. Those factors are land, labor, and capital. And capital here means money or investments. And then you have the idea or the know-how to do it. And so all of these things come together, just as we brought all of these things together for the bread, they come together, and the end result is sugarcane production, or the final product, sugar. But today we want to focus specifically on that factor or that component, labor. That labor, that factor, is a very important factor, and so as we deal with it, I want you to think about it in the broader context of your syllabus. And the theme that this will come under would be the theme Caribbean economy and slavery. And that's very important to remember and keep in mind, because we are thinking of it as an economic activity. So the production of sugar and sugarcane, the planting of sugarcane, was an economic activity. It was a relationship between supply and demand. The trade in enslaved Africans was an economic activity, so that's the supply, and it fulfilled an economic need. Always keep that in mind, because that will inform a lot of the things that we will talk about today. So as we proceed, there are some words and terms that we would meet in this lesson that I would like to define at this time. So the word ideology, we will come across that word. Some of you may already know the meaning of this word, but let's think about it in this way. An ideology is a set of opinions or beliefs of a group or an individual. That's an ideology. The next term that I want to define is perspective. A perspective is a particular way of viewing things that depends on one's experience and personality. And finally, we will meet the word revisionist. That's a big word, but it's very simple to understand. If you describe someone or their views as revisionist, what you really mean is that that person rejects traditionally held beliefs about a particular historical event or events. So that's a revisionist. So maybe at the end of the lesson, some of you may refer to yourselves as revisionists. Who knows? So we want to look at two perspectives, or two views, yes, two views for the reasons why Africans were used as enslaved labor. we have the traditional perspective. That perspective was a perspective that came from Europe. So European historians and European leaders would have advanced these perspectives as reasons for the use of enslaved Africans. And then we have a Caribbean perspective. This perspective would have been advanced by Caribbean authors, Caribbean leaders who revised and reject the traditionally held views and perspectives that were advanced before. So we have the European perspective and the Caribbean perspective. So let's talk about the reasons for the use of enslaved Africans, but we're going to look first at the European perspective. The first reason advanced by Europeans for the use of Africans as enslaved labor was the sugar revolution. Of course, this is something that we would have done before in previous lessons. So just by way of revision, the sugar revolution, as you would recall, was that switch from tobacco to sugarcane cultivation. Tobacco to sugarcane cultivation. And that change was not, it's referred to as a revolution, not because there were guns and blood and war, but simply because it brought about such far-reaching changes to the society at the time. So that change required certain things. You remember our factors of production? What were they? Land, labor, and capital, yes. And tobacco needed very small plots in order to be cultivated for economic gain. It also needed very little initial output. A tobacco farmer didn't need much money or much capital to begin cultivating tobacco. And in terms of labor, which is our focus today, labor as well, he didn't need much or large labor force. As a matter of fact, he would have used his family members and maybe a few servants. But let's focus on sugar. Sugar needed a large land holdings or large farmlands. And so we can already see from this chart, this table here, we can already make a comparison. Tobacco, small plots; sugar, large farmlands. Sugarcane cultivation also needed large sums of money and huge capital investments. Those of you who are doing POB and economics, you can relate to this. So you needed huge sums of money to begin planting sugarcane for it to be profitable. And labor, the labor needed to be large, cheap, and at least 100 persons for that plantation to be profitable. So Europeans put forward this reason, the change from tobacco to sugar cultivation, as one of the reasons why Africans were enslaved and used and captured in large numbers and brought to the Caribbean to be used on the plantations. The second reason advanced by Europeans is the decline in the indigenous population. Again, from your previous knowledge, from what you would have done before, you know that the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 spelled disaster for the indigenous people. In 1492, the first set of Europeans came and other Europeans followed. The Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and they had far-reaching effects on the indigenous people. The chart here shows the projected numbers in population at the time of Columbus's arrival and the same figures for the middle of the 17th century. And that is when the sugar revolution actually took place. So the numbers were at 125 million, and those numbers decreased to almost 2 million by the middle of the 17th century. And so that decline in the indigenous population meant that there was not a ready supply of labor available to the Europeans so that they can use that as a profitable labor force. So they advanced this as a reason for using Africans as the labor force. And so let's look at our third traditional perspective. This perspective is related to the use of white bonded servants. And as you would recall again, white bonded servants were another source of labor that were used by Europeans for their profit. Now, the white bonded servants, they were mainly from Ireland and Scotland, and they would sign contracts and they would come to the Caribbean and they would work as indentured workers on the tobacco plantations or the tobacco farms, and sometimes eventually on the sugar estates. But that did not work out because the supply of white bonded servants began to dwindle. Now that dwindling supply, or that supply being lessened, meant that there was not this ready access of labor. And why did that supply become less? Because after a while, the white bonded servants refused to work on the plantations, refused to work on the farms, because they felt it beneath them to work alongside the indigenous people and even alongside the Africans. So they eventually refused to work. After their contracts were up, they left the plantations and refused to work. In addition to that, they succumbed to tropical diseases. They were not naturally immune to some of the diseases that were here in the Caribbean, and so their numbers, they died out as a result. So we've heard of those three reasons why Africans were used on the plantations, and those reasons are the traditional reasons, the reasons advanced by Europeans. But let's look at the reasons that we would refer to as revisionist. So this perspective is the revisionist perspective, one that is advanced by Caribbean authors, Caribbean thinkers, Caribbean intellects, who is showing us a different way of looking at why Africans were used as enslaved persons on the plantations. Remember, we said the plantation system and the cultivation of sugarcane was an economic activity. And so you always have to keep the big picture in mind. It's an economic activity, and what do you go into business to do? Yeah, you go into business to make a profit. And so you would want to do things that are economically feasible. And so the first reason advanced by Caribbean historians, which is our revisionist perspective, was the fact that the use of Africans was an affordable option. So the affordability. Eric Williams, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, he gives this very interesting quote. He says, the colonies needed labor and resorted to African labor. Why? Because it was cheapest and best. And so, why was it cheaper? It was cheaper because if you buy an enslaved person, then you don't have to pay that person a wage for the rest of their profitable life. However, if you were to contract an indentured laborer, you have to continue paying wages. And so it was cheaper to go the way of getting an enslaved person to do the labor, because that wage factor was no longer there. So accessibility, affordability would have been the first reason, the first revisionist reason that we can think of for the use of Africans as enslaved labor. The second reason that we can look at as a revisionist perspective is the accessibility. It's no secret that Africa was already known to Europe, And as early as the 15th century, the established links between Africa and Europe is already there. Since the Portuguese were looking for a route to India and China, they navigated around Africa. So they were aware of the presence of Africa. They were aware of the kings who would cooperate with them. And so that accessibility made it possible for Europeans to turn to Africa as an alternative labor source. And added to that, the African kings, they established these relationships, and so that relationship began to foster what would come to be known as the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. So far we have seen the revisionist perspective of affordability and the revisionist perspective of accessibility. And the third revisionist perspective goes back to European views, but this time it's how the Europeans perceived Africans. The Europeans at the time perceived Africans to be strong and accustomed to working in agriculture. So therefore, they will do well as slaves. They also saw them as being accustomed to the tropical climate, because the climate in the west coast of Africa is quite similar to the climate in the Caribbean. So Europeans held this view that they can be used, Africans can be used because they're accustomed to the tropical climate. Another view that you may have heard is that slavery existed in Africa. So since slavery existed in Africa, Africans are accustomed to slavery and being enslaved, so they will do well being slaves in the Caribbean. And so these views guided the Europeans in their choice for Africans. One that is a very touchy subject that we must talk about because it is part of the revisionist perspective is the whole idea of the European racist ideology. At the time, and that when we say this, the time that we're talking about is the middle of the 17th century, and even before, there was a prevailing thought among Europeans that Africans were barbaric savages, they were demonic, and therefore enslaving them was a way of moving them out of that darkness into light. And so the enslavement of Africans would have a civilizing effect on them. Yes, I know, it is as ridiculous as it sounds. And another racist ideology was Africans were inferior and Europeans were superior. And as unbelievable as this sounds, it was a view that was widely held by Europeans, so much so that a whole branch of science started just simply proving that Africans were phenotypically and genotypically inferior to Europeans. So they measured the heads of the skulls of an African, and they measured the skull of a European, and they saw that the sizes were a little different and the shapes were different, and therefore that means that the two groups would have been thinking differently, and so that pointed to the inferiority of Africans. So this was a whole branch of pseudoscience that science today has since discarded and thrown out as nothing but rubbish. And so this racist ideology was in fact part of the revisionist theories of the reasons for enslaved Africans. So we've looked at some traditional views and we've looked at some revisionist views, and I want to go into a little quiz at this time. So if you know the answer, you can just say it out loud. So the first question: which statement is true of the economic activity in the British West Indies from the 1640s? And the 1640s can also be described as the second half of the 17th century. So look at these choices. Which statement is true? In the second half of the 17th century, what happened? Well, if you responded B, then you're correct. The second half of the 17th century, we did see a switch from tobacco to sugarcane cultivation as the main export crops, mainly in the French colonies and the British colonies. Let's look at question number 2. Which of the following sources of labor were used by Europeans prior to the enslavement of Africans in the 1600s? So, looking at these choices, which would you choose as labor that the Europeans would have used before the sugar revolution, before the 17th century? And so if you chose B and D, then you were correct. B and D, the indigenous people and white bonded servants. Is this true or false? The indigenous populations in the Caribbean were too limited to successfully cultivate sugar. Right, that is true. Enslaved Africans, this is question 4. Enslaved African labor was used to cultivate sugarcane in the British West Indies because white bonded servants refused to do such work. Yes, and that's also true. Because the white bonded servants felt that it was beneath them to work alongside Africans. Question number 5. White bonded servants were cheaper laborers than enslaved Africans in the 17th century. Is that true or false? Well, that's false. It was not cheaper to get white bonded servants, free labor as opposed to paid labor, and enslaved Africans were free labor, and the white bonded servants were paid labor. And question number 6. Europeans had already established links with West African kings since the 1400s, and this helped to foster the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. Is that true or false? That's true. And this question, number 7, the Europeans used racist ideology to justify enslaving African people to labor on sugar estates in the Caribbean. Is that true or false? Yes, that's true. And question number 9, which of the following factors, and this question you have to read very carefully because you have to choose all that are correct. Which of the following are factors that made Africa an attractive source of enslaved laborers to Europeans? Right, so your choices are, is the correct answer 1 and 4? Is it 1, 3, and 4? Is it 2, 3, and 4? Or is all of the choices there correct? So you look at it carefully. And the correct answer is 1, 3, and 4. So that is choice B. So we've come to the end of today's lesson, and I just would want to review what we would have done today. We looked at the factors of production that went into the production and cultivation of sugarcane and extracted that one factor, labor, and looked at reasons for the use of enslaved Africans as laborers. There were 2 views, 2 perspectives that were advanced. There is the traditional perspective. So when you read certain history books, you would see those perspectives, and there are the revisionist perspectives. The traditional perspectives are advanced by Europeans, and they are the change from tobacco to sugarcane, the decline of indigenous population, and the limited supply of white bonded servants. And the revisionist perspectives claims or states that Africans were used as enslaved labor because of their affordability, their accessibility, and European racist ideology. Good, so we've come to the end of the lesson for today, and I want to thank you for paying attention and for doing so well. You answered the questions well and everything. And when you think of this topic, I want you to continue to look at the big picture, which is Caribbean economy and slavery. Thank you once again.